The little boy's sobs echoed through the empty house as he clutched his teddy bear tightly, tears staining his cheeks. "Papa locks me in the dark when you leave," he whimpered, his voice trembling with fear. His words were like a cold chill, running down anyone's spine. A cry for help no one seemed to hear. The mother, heartbroken and desperate, had no idea how to protect him from the nightmare he faced whenever his father was gone. As time passed, the boy grew silent, the fear turning into a shadow that clung to him. But 8 years later, the nurse who once cared for him returned to town, and when she entered the familiar house, her blood ran cold as she realized the horrors that had unfolded in those dark corners. The boy's past was about to come back, to haunt them all. The little boy's sobs pierced the silence of the dimly lit room, his tiny body trembling with fear. "Papa locks me in the dark when you leave," he cried, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder would make the nightmare worse. His words hung in the air like a sinister warning, the kind that chills your soul and makes you question everything you thought you knew. His mother stood frozen, unable to move, her heart sinking with a mixture of disbelief and dread. She had no idea that the man she trusted, the one who promised to protect their family, was the one who was tearing it apart. Years passed, and the boy grew quieter, the darkness becoming his only companion. But then, 8 years later, the nurse who had once been a witness to his suffering returned to the town. The moment she set foot inside the house, something felt wrong. Something was off, like the very walls held secrets they were desperate to keep buried. As she walked through the rooms, her blood ran cold when she realized the truth. The darkness had never left, and it was still waiting to claim them all. The little boy's sobs echoed with an innocence too pure for the harsh world he was forced to endure. "Papa locks me in the dark when you leave," he whispered, his voice cracking with vulnerability. His small hands gripped the worn fabric of his teddy bear, the only comfort he had in a world that seemed to offer none. His eyes, wide and full of fear, pleaded for someone, anyone, to make it stop. His mother, heartbroken and trembling, knelt beside him, desperate to understand the depths of his terror. She hadn't seen the truth, hadn't understood the silent cry for help hidden beneath her son's fearful silence. How could she have known that the man she married, the man she trusted, was the one who had filled their home with darkness, not the kind that could be chased away by a simple light, but a kind that burrowed deep into the soul? The boy's innocence was slipping away piece by piece as the shadows claimed more of his heart, leaving behind a child who feared the very idea of being alone. The mother's heart shattered as she tried to protect him, but every time she thought she understood, the truth seemed more out of reach, buried beneath layers of fear and confusion. 8 years later, the nurse who once took care of the boy came back to town. She had remembered the boy's cries, the same ones that had haunted her dreams, and when she entered the house, the familiar scent of old wood and dust didn't bring comfort. Instead, it felt suffocating. She walked through the rooms, but the weight of the memories felt heavier than ever. She had known that something wasn't right back then, but she hadn't been able to put the pieces together. Now, standing in the very place where the boy had once sobbed, her heart sank as she realized how the years had left scars, ones that no amount of time could heal. The innocence in his eyes that once reflected the purity of childhood had been replaced by a darkness too heavy for someone so young to carry. The boy wasn't the same anymore, and neither was the house. It was as if the walls themselves held the secrets of a life that had been slowly drained of all light. The nurse's blood ran cold, not just for the boy's fate, but for the chilling truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along. As the nurse walked deeper into the house, She could feel the weight of the years pressing down on her. The silence of the rooms, once filled with the sounds of a family's laughter and life, now seemed hollow, empty in a way that went beyond the absence of sound. It was as if the walls themselves bore witness to the pain and the secrets that had been locked away for far too long. Her mind raced back to the days when she had first cared for the little boy. She remembered his innocent eyes, the way he clung to her for comfort, the way his small voice trembled with fear at even the slightest sound in the dark. Back then, she had assumed it was just the fears of childhood, the typical anxiety every child experiences. But now, with the weight of time and experience, she saw things differently. She saw how innocence can be so easily shattered when trust is betrayed, when the people you love and rely on become the source of your greatest fears. The truth hit her with the force of a tidal wave. The boy's sobs, his cries for help, were not just the ramblings of a frightened child. They were the desperate plea of someone who had been wronged, someone who had been trapped in a nightmare no child should ever face. The nurse's heart ached as she reflected on the moral awakening she herself had gone through. She realized how easily it is to turn a blind eye when things aren't directly in our line of sight, to convince ourselves that things aren't as bad as they seem because it's too painful to face the reality. She had been just as guilty. She hadn't seen the signs. She hadn't understood that the darkness the boy spoke of was not just metaphorical. It was real, and it was suffocating him. In the years since, the nurse had witnessed countless cases of abuse, neglect, and trauma. But none had hit her as hard as this. This wasn't just about one child's suffering. It was a stark reminder of the responsibility we all have to protect the vulnerable, to listen when they speak, and to never assume someone else will take care of what we know needs to be addressed. She felt a burning need to make things right, to be the voice for the boy who had never been heard, to be the one who would shine a light in the darkest corners of his life. This moral awakening, this realization that silence and inaction only perpetuate the harm, pushed her forward with newfound determination. As she stood there, in the same place where that little boy had once cried out in fear, the nurse swore to herself that she would do whatever it took to make sure that no child, no matter how innocent, would ever have to suffer in silence again. The past could not be changed, but the future could still be shaped. And in that moment, she knew she had to be the catalyst for that change, no matter how difficult or painful the journey would be. It was time to face the truth, to confront the darkness head-on, and to give that boy, and every other child like him, the chance at a life filled with light and safety. The air in the old house was thick with the kind of silence that weighs heavily on the heart. The nurse stood at the threshold of the living room, a place she had once seen full of life, now eerily still, the weight of time and tragedy pressing down on her. She felt the overwhelming presence of memories, not the comforting kind, but the kind that haunt you, linger in your mind, and refuse to let you forget the things you'd rather not know. She had known this family years ago, when the boy was just a child, barely 5 years old, but his innocence had been shattered long before. She had arrived on the scene. She had been his caretaker for a while, and in the brief moments they shared, he had left a lasting mark on her heart. She had been just starting out in her nursing career, full of compassion and hope. She'd always wanted to make a difference, to help those who couldn't help themselves. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to discover. At the time, she had been too naive, too eager to think the best of people, to see only what they allowed her to see. She was trained to care for patients, not to uncover the darkest secrets buried within families. She remembered the boy's trembling hands, his quiet whispers when his father's back was turned, the fleeting look of terror in his eyes whenever he was left alone in the dark. She hadn't understood it then. Not fully. How could she have? She was new to the world of nursing, knew to the kinds of pain children carry in silence, and she had been too focused on the day-to-day tasks of caring for a sick child to notice the subtle signs of something more sinister lurking beneath the surface. But now, as she stood in the very house where the boy's cries had once echoed through the night, she could feel it. The weight of the suffering that had been buried here. For years, the walls, the floors, even the air felt different. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to be revealed, something that had been kept hidden for far too long. The nurse's heart clenched in her chest as she stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room, the familiar surroundings now clouded with the harsh clarity of truth. She could almost hear the boy's soft sobs, the way his voice had cracked in fear, the way he had begged her to stay with him when his father was gone. "Please don't leave me alone," he had whispered, his small hands gripping her sleeve, his eyes wide with terror. The nurse had thought it was just the anxiety of a young child, the kind that came with separation from a parent. But now, years later, with the knowledge and experience she had gained, she could see the signs of something much darker. She could see how a child's innocent plea had been dismissed, how a mother's concerns had been ignored, how the truth had been buried under layers of denial and fear. She hadn't known then, but she knew now. There had been more going on in this house than anyone had realized. The boy's fear had not been a figment of his imagination. It had been the result of something much more terrifying. As the nurse made her way through the house, she passed the boy's old room, the room where he had once slept so soundly, his teddy bear clutched tightly in his arms. She couldn't help but pause at the door, her hand resting on the doorknob, her heart racing in her chest. The memories flooded back, unbidden and sharp, the sounds of his cries, the way he would whisper in the dark, begging for comfort, for safety, for someone to listen. She could still remember the look on his face when he had told her, "Papa locks me in the dark when you leave." The words had haunted her for years, echoing in her mind long after she had left the house. She had always wondered what he had meant by that, what darkness he was referring to. But now, standing in the same place where he had once cried out in fear, she understood. The darkness he spoke of wasn't just the absence of light. It was the kind of darkness that seeps into the soul, the kind that makes you believe there is no escape, no way out. It was the kind of darkness that left a child so broken, so terrified, that he couldn't speak of it without trembling. The nurse's throat tightened as she fought to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. The boy, no, the young man now, had never had the chance to be a child. His innocence had been stolen from him long before he could understand what was happening. The nurse's mind raced as she tried to reconcile the boy she had known with the man he must have become. What had happened to him after she left? How had his life unfolded in the years since she'd walked out of this house, unaware of the depth of the pain that still haunted him? It wasn't until she walked into the kitchen, where the boy's mother used to stand, preparing meals with a quiet smile, that she truly understood the depth of the tragedy. The mother, once so full of warmth and love, had been complicit in the darkness. She had chosen to ignore the signs, to overlook the boy's cries, to believe that everything was fine because it was easier to live in denial than face the truth. The nurse had always respected the mother, had thought her a kind woman, but now she saw that her own ignorance had contributed to the suffering of her child. She could no longer blame the father, the one who had locked the boy in the dark. She realized that both parents had failed the child in their own way. The nurse felt a deep sense of regret. She had missed the signs, hadn't pushed harder to understand what was happening. She had assumed, just like the mother had, that everything was okay, that the boy was just going through a phase. She couldn't undo the past, But standing here in the aftermath of the boy's suffering, she realized that the only thing she could do now was to make sure that this kind of thing never happened again. Her hand reached out to touch the counter, and for a brief moment she felt as though she could still feel the boy's presence in this place. His laughter, his joy, his pain, all of it was still there, woven into the very fabric of the house. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, since she had arrived, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what had been lost, what had been broken. The emotional moment hit her like a wave, crashing over her with an intensity she hadn't been prepared for. The nurse's heart broke for the boy who had once trusted her, for the boy who had cried out in fear, and for the boy who had grown up far too fast, carrying a darkness no child should ever have to bear. With a final solemn glance around the room, she turned and walked toward the door. But as she left the house, she knew that she would carry the boy's story with her for the rest of her life. She would never forget him, never forget the sound of his sobs, and never forget the lessons she had learned in this place. She had been given the gift of a moral awakening, a realization that sometimes, in order to help, we must first confront the darkness ourselves. And in that moment, the nurse understood that the healing process had to start with the truth, no matter how painful or difficult it was to face. The nurse stepped out of the house, her mind swirling with the overwhelming emotions of the past few hours. The weight of the years, the boy's silent suffering, and the realization that no one had truly seen him, not in the way he needed, made her heart ache with a deep, aching sorrow. She had thought that once she entered the house, she would find answers, maybe even a sense of closure. But the truth was more complicated, more twisted than she could have ever imagined. As she made her way down the creaky front steps, she heard the faint sound of a car approaching, and instinctively, her gaze turned toward the street. A black sedan rolled slowly into the driveway, its engine humming as it came to a stop. The nurse's heart skipped a beat. A figure stepped out of the car, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit. Her eyes widened with shock as she recognized him. It was the boy, the child who had once clung to her, terrified of the dark, the boy who had suffered in silence, the one who had once whispered in her ear, begging her to stay. But now, standing before her was not the child she remembered. The boy had grown into a man, cold, distant, his eyes a reflection of the same fear, but something darker now lurked beneath the surface. His face, once filled with innocence, now wore the hardened expression of someone who had seen too much. "Ma'am," he said in a low, calm voice, his tone almost chilling in its detachment. "I've been expecting you." The nurse froze, her breath catching in her throat. This was the boy. She could feel it in the way he stood, in the set of his shoulders, in the way his eyes seemed to see right through her, as if he already knew everything she had been thinking. How could he possibly know she was here? She had never contacted him, never tried to reach out, and yet he stood there as though he had been waiting for her all along. I don't understand," the nurse stammered, her heart pounding in her chest. "How did you know I was coming?" The man, her patient, the little boy she had once cared for, gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I know you've been thinking about me. I know you've been wondering about what happened to me." He stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "The truth is, I've been waiting for this moment, for the moment when you'd finally understand the real story." The nurse's mind reeled. She had so many questions, so many things she had never been able to comprehend. The boy's suffering had haunted her for years, but now, standing before her, was a man whose presence seemed to radiate a kind of dark power. She opened her mouth to speak, but he raised a hand to silence her. You've been blaming my father. Blaming my mother, he continued, his voice still calm, almost too calm. But you don't know the full story. You don't know what really happened. The nurse felt a chill run down her spine. She had no idea what he meant. She had assumed for all these years that the boy had been a victim, that he had suffered because of his father's cruelty. But now, standing before her, there was something unsettling in the way he spoke, as if he knew more than he was letting on. 8 years ago, he said, when I was locked in that dark room, something inside me changed. It wasn't just fear I felt. It was power. The power of knowing that I could survive the worst things this world could throw at me. I learned to control it, to use it. The darkness that my father left me in, it became a part of me. But what you don't know is that my father didn't lock me in the dark to punish me. He locked me in to teach me how to survive. He knew that I would have to be strong, that one day I'd have to face the real world. The nurse's mind struggled to keep up. This wasn't the boy she had known. The boy who had trembled in the dark, the boy who had whispered his fears, had been replaced by a man who seemed to have embraced the darkness, the very thing that had once terrified him. "Your father?" she asked, her voice trembling. He did this to you?" The man shook his head slowly, his eyes dark with something she couldn't place. "You still don't understand. My father wasn't the monster you think he was. He was preparing me for something bigger, something no one else could teach me. You see, when I was locked away, I wasn't just abandoned. I was given a chance to see the world for what it truly is. Brutal, unforgiving, and filled with shadows that will swallow you whole if you're not careful. My father knew that I would need to learn that lesson early." The nurse felt her heart race as she processed his words. She had thought the boy's cries had been the sound of a child in need of help. She had assumed that the darkness was something he had suffered through, that he had been a victim of his father's cruelty. But now, the truth seemed more twisted. Was it possible that the boy, the child who had once begged her for help, had been taught to embrace the very thing he feared? The man continued, his voice almost hypnotic. "I didn't just survive that darkness. I became it. And now, I've come back to finish what was started. The darkness you think is so terrifying? It's just a part of me now. And I'm not afraid of it anymore." The nurse's blood ran cold. She had never imagined this. She had never considered the possibility that the boy had been changed by his suffering, had been shaped into something else entirely. The twist was too much for her to comprehend. The child she had once tried to protect had become something she didn't recognize, something she feared. "I'm not the boy you remember," he said, his voice growing colder. "And I never will be again. I've learned what I needed to learn, and now, it's your turn." The nurse stood frozen, the realization crashing down on her like a tidal wave. The boy had never been a helpless victim. He had learned to harness the darkness within him, and now he was using it as a weapon, against her, against everyone who had ever believed he was innocent. The truth was far more chilling than she could have ever imagined. The boy's suffering had been a means to an end, not a sign of weakness, but of strength. And now, standing before her, he was a living testament to that power. As the nurse stood there listening to the chilling words of the man before her, a wave of realization hit her that left her breathless. This wasn't the boy she had once cared for. He had become someone else, someone unrecognizable, and yet there was something in his eyes, a depth, a weight, that made her heart sink with understanding. It was as though the years had not just passed, but had shaped him in ways she had never anticipated. His transformation, however, wasn't just a result of the darkness he had embraced, but of something deeper, something that had been buried within him all along, a silent sacrifice, one made by a father who had chosen to train his son in the harshest of ways, and one that, as the nurse now realized, had been for a purpose far beyond her comprehension. The man before her, with his hardened exterior and cold demeanor, hadn't arrived here by accident. His suffering wasn't a mere consequence of neglect or cruelty. It was a deliberate, calculated sacrifice that had been made by a father who had believed that in order for his son to survive the unforgiving world, he had to be forged in the fire of fear and isolation. The nurse's mind flashed back to the moments she had spent with the boy, the way his small body had trembled in her arms, the way his eyes had looked to her for safety, and how each time she had left, the fear in his eyes deepened. She had assumed that his father was a villain, the one to blame for his suffering. But now, standing here in front of her, the man who had once been that helpless child, she realized how little she had understood. The father's choice, locking his son in the dark, forcing him to confront his deepest fears alone, wasn't just a form of punishment. It was an act of silent sacrifice. The man, whom she had once blamed for his cruelty, had made a decision that no one could fathom. He had chosen the suffering of his child over the comfort of allowing him to live a normal, sheltered life, and in doing so, he had hoped to equip his son with the strength and resilience he would need to face a world that, in his eyes, was only out to break him. The nurse's heart clenched as she stood there, torn between sympathy and horror. The boy, now a man, had been taught that his worth was tied to his ability to survive, to endure, to rise above the darkness. He had been abandoned by the one person who should have loved him unconditionally, forced to face his fears in isolation. But in that solitude, he had found something more, an unshakable strength, the kind that comes only when one has been stripped of all comfort, all protection, and forced to confront the world without the safety of innocence. The silent sacrifice was the father's, a sacrifice that no one had truly understood. He had chosen to give his son the hardest lesson of all, survival in a world that would not care about his fragility, that would not shield him from harm. And though the nurse had initially seen it as cruelty, she began to see it through a different lens. The father's action, as painful as it had been for the boy, had been born of love, a love twisted by a belief that the boy's life would be better if he could be made stronger, if he could be prepared for the worst. The boy had paid the price for his father's decision, sacrificing his innocence, his childhood, his sense of security, all in exchange for the ability to survive. And in doing so, he had become something other than a victim. He had become a survivor, someone capable of enduring the worst kinds of pain and fear without breaking. But at what cost? The nurse took a step back, her mind reeling as she struggled to make sense of the twisted layers of sacrifice that had shaped this man before her. The emotional weight of it all began to settle in, a burden she could barely carry. She had never understood what it meant to truly sacrifice for someone else, to give up something so precious in the hope that they would be better for it in the end. But now, she saw that it wasn't just the father who had sacrificed. The boy had made his own sacrifice too. He had sacrificed the light of his childhood, the warmth of his parents' love, in order to become someone capable of facing the brutal realities of life. The boy's suffering had been silent, unseen, but it had been the foundation upon which his strength had been built. As the nurse processed this realization, she felt a deep sense of guilt. In her attempt to protect the boy, in her desire to fix what had been broken, she had never fully understood the sacrifice that had been made. She had seen the boy as a victim, a child in need of rescue. But now, she saw the truth. He had been chosen for a different path, one that required suffering in order to rise above it, one that required him to endure what no child should ever have to endure in order to become something stronger, something more capable of surviving the world's cruelties. "Do you understand now?" the man asked, his voice softer than before, almost as if he were speaking to himself as much as to her. "My father didn't abandon me. He gave me the strength I needed to survive. He made the hardest decision of his life so I wouldn't be weak. And I—" His voice faltered for a brief moment, a flicker of something vulnerable passing through his eyes before he quickly masked it with a cold indifference. "I'm the product of that sacrifice. I am who I am because of what he did." The nurse's throat tightened as she tried to absorb the magnitude of what he was saying. The man before her had not just survived his childhood, he had become a living testament to a silent sacrifice that no one would ever truly understand. His suffering, his strength, and his coldness were all intertwined in a web of decisions made in the name of love and survival. The nurse couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of sorrow, not just for the boy who had suffered, but for the father who had believed that this was the only way to ensure his son's survival. In the end, they had both paid a heavy price for their decisions. The boy had lost his innocence, but in return, he had gained the fortitude to face whatever life threw at him. And the father, in his attempt to shield his son from the world's cruelty, had sacrificed his own ability to protect him in the ways a parent should. The silence between them grew heavier, the unspoken understanding of what had transpired settling in. The nurse realized with a deep and painful clarity that some sacrifices were never meant to be understood, never meant to be recognized. They were born out of love. But often, love's cost was a burden far too great to bear. As she turned to leave, the nurse's heart was heavy with the knowledge that some stories are too complicated to be neatly explained, and some sacrifices too great to ever be fully acknowledged. She left the house that day with the understanding that not all suffering is born from malice, and that sometimes the greatest acts of love are the ones that hurt the most. The nurse stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes locked onto the man before her, the boy she had once known, now transformed into someone almost unrecognizable. The chill of the moment gripped her heart, but beneath the shock there was something else, an unmistakable surge of protective instinct. In that moment, her focus shifted. She no longer saw the cold, distant figure standing before her, but the broken child she had once cared for, the boy she had held in her arms, desperate to ease his pain, desperate to shield him from the darkness. It was as though the years had not passed at all. Beneath the hardened surface, she could still see traces of the child who had cried out for help, the innocent soul who had been left in a place far more terrifying than anyone could comprehend. Her protective instincts flared to life, not just for the boy he had been, but for the man he had become. She could feel her pulse quicken, a determination rising in her chest. She wasn't about to let him slip through her fingers again, not like this. The years of training, the endless hours of caring for patients, had taught her one thing above all else: the power of empathy and the necessity of standing firm when someone needed saving. The boy, no, the man before her may have seemed far beyond reach, but she couldn't bring herself to believe he was lost entirely. She couldn't turn her back on him now. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady though her heart was pounding. "You're not alone anymore. I see what you've become, but I also see the boy who needed help, who still needs help. You may have learned to survive, but you don't have to carry that burden alone." Her words came out slow, deliberate, as though each one was a promise, one that she would not break, not again. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes were cold, emotionless. But there was something behind them, something lurking just beneath the surface. For a moment, she saw a flicker of vulnerability, and it was enough to make her believe that the fight was still worth it. She stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "Do you remember what it was like?" she asked gently, her voice full of warmth. "Do you remember the times when you were just a child, when the dark wasn't something you could control, when it terrified you?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed as though he was going to turn away, to walk back into the abyss that had consumed him. But the nurse wasn't ready to let go. She wasn't ready to let him slip further into the darkness without at least one last attempt to reach him. She moved closer, her hands trembling with both fear and resolve. She had seen countless patients in her career, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The moment when someone she had cared for, someone she had tried to protect, had become so distant, so lost. "I know you don't want to hear this," she continued, her voice soft, but unwavering. "But you don't have to be the person you think you have to be. You don't have to carry all of this anger, all of this fear, alone. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You just need to let someone help you, just like you needed it back then." There was a long silence. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, but the atmosphere between them seemed to shift. It wasn't a complete change, not yet, but it was enough to make her feel as though there was still hope, that perhaps, just perhaps, the child she had once tried to save was still, somewhere deep inside this man. The protective energy coursing through the nurse was palpable now. She wasn't just standing there anymore. She was actively reaching out to him, emotionally and mentally. She wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. Not when she knew there was still a chance for him, even if it was a slim one. She couldn't allow him to believe that the only thing that mattered now was the dark, the pain, the suffering he had endured. She couldn't let him think that he was defined by what he had survived, not when there was so much more to him than that. Her hand reached out instinctively, not with hesitation but with the full weight of her conviction. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "Let me help you. Let me show you that you don't have to be alone in this anymore. Let me show you that you don't have to be this stranger. You can be better. You deserve better." In that moment, she wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a protector, a force of determination and love that refused to let the darkness claim another soul. She had made a promise to herself long ago that she would never give up on those who needed help. No matter how lost they seemed, no matter how much they had pushed her away, she would always fight for them. And right now, she was fighting for him. The boy who had once been her patient, the boy who had once trusted her with his tears and his fears. He stood still, his body tense, his face unreadable. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. But then, just when she thought he might turn away, his eyes softened, ever so slightly, and for the first time in years, the nurse saw something that she hadn't seen in him since that night so many years ago. Hope. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore," he said, his voice low, raw with the weight of the years. "I've been on my own for so long, I don't know if I can let anyone in." She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Her gaze remained steady, filled with the quiet strength of someone who had seen too many battles and too many lives broken to ever give up on this one. "You don't have to trust me all at once," she said, "but you can trust that I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for you, whether you like it or not. You don't have to face this alone anymore." Her words hung in the air, a promise that she intended to keep. There was something in his eyes now, a crack in the wall he had built around himself, and she was determined to break through it piece by piece. She would fight for him. She would be the shield he had never had, the support he had always been, denied. And no matter how long it took, no matter how hard the journey ahead might be, she would stay by his side. The nurse stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. As she gazed at the man before her, a man who had once been a vulnerable boy begging for protection, she felt an overwhelming sense of regret. She had been a part of his life once, during a time when he had needed someone to care for him, someone to protect him from the dark. And yet, in all the years that had passed, she had not been there. She had left, moved on with her life, while he had been left behind to carry the heavy burden of those childhood scars. The regret weighed heavily on her heart, twisting in ways she hadn't expected. She had failed him then. And now, here he was, broken, hardened by years of pain and isolation, a man she barely recognized. The guilt gnawed at her. Had she done enough? Could she have stayed, done more to save him from the horrors of his father's cruel treatment? She couldn't shake the images from her mind, the boy sobbing in the dark, his face contorted with fear, his voice trembling as he begged for someone to hear him, to save him. She had thought that leaving him behind had been the best choice, that it was the right thing to do. But now, in the face of the man he had become, she realized that in her absence, she had abandoned him. Not physically, but emotionally. She had failed to realize that her duty to him hadn't ended when she walked out the door that day. It had only just begun. The nurse's throat tightened as she tried to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She could see the transformation in the man before her, the coldness, the indifference, the walls he had built around himself to keep everyone out. It was as if the boy who had cried out for help no longer existed, replaced by someone who had learned to survive without the support he had once so desperately needed. And now, the nurse couldn't help but wonder, had she contributed to this? Had her departure, her failure to stay, led him down this dark path? "I should have been there," she whispered almost to herself. The words hung heavy in the air. Between them, a confession of guilt she had buried deep for so long. She had always told herself she couldn't have done more, that there was nothing else she could have done to save him. But standing here now, seeing the man he had become, she knew deep down that she had made a choice to walk away. And that choice had come with consequences. The man looked at her, his expression unreadable. But something shifted in his eyes as he listened to her words, something that hadn't been there before. Perhaps a flicker of acknowledgement, or maybe even a hint of understanding. He said nothing at first, but the silence between them was charged with the weight of the past. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he spoke. "You weren't the one who abandoned me," he said, his words laced with bitterness, but also with something else, a trace of sorrow, a trace of truth. "It wasn't you who locked me away in the dark. It wasn't you who forced me to grow up alone, to face the world without anyone by my side. It was him." He paused, his face hardening as the anger flared inside him. "It was my father who did that to me, not you. You didn't fail me." The nurse felt a wave of shock wash over her as she processed his words. For so long she had carried the weight of guilt, blaming herself for not doing more, for not staying in his life, for not intervening. But now, standing here, she realized that the burden of blame wasn't hers to carry alone. The man before her had suffered, yes, but not at her hands. She hadn't been the one who had locked him away in the dark. She hadn't been the one who had forced him to grow up in isolation. And yet, the guilt she had felt was not entirely unfounded. She had abandoned him in his time of need, and though she had never meant to, her absence had left a hole in his life that no one else had been able to fill. "I know it wasn't you," the nurse replied, her voice cracking with emotion, "but I still should have done more. I should have stayed. I should have fought harder to protect you." Her voice grew stronger with each word, the regret in her chest slowly giving way to a sense of determination. "I failed you when you needed me most, and I can never undo that. But what I can do now is try. I can try to help you heal, to help you find peace, to help you find redemption, for both of us." For a long time, the man said nothing. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. But then slowly, a shift began to take place. The anger that had once consumed him started to soften, replaced by a quiet resignation. He wasn't the same person he had been before, and neither was she. But there was a glimmer of something there, something she hadn't seen in him for years. The possibility of change, the possibility of healing. "You're right," he finally said, his voice low but steady. "I've spent my whole life blaming others for what happened to me. My father, you, the world. It didn't matter. I was angry, and I lashed out at everyone, even at myself. But I see now that redemption isn't about pointing fingers or finding someone to blame. It's about finding a way to forgive, to let go of the past, and to move forward." The nurse's heart swelled as she listened to him speak. It was as if a weight had been lifted from both of their shoulders, a weight they had carried for so long. She had expected this moment to be filled with anger, with more pain, more regret. But instead, there was something else, something softer, something more hopeful. She had never imagined that he would be able to let go of the bitterness that had defined his life for so long. But now, standing here before her, it seemed possible. "I've spent too long in the dark," the man continued, his voice gaining strength. "I thought that by shutting everyone out, by staying in the darkness, I was protecting myself. But I see now that I was only hurting myself more." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to find the truth in her gaze. "I don't know if I can ever truly redeem myself. I don't know if I can ever forgive my father. But maybe I can start by forgiving myself." The nurse nodded, her heart aching with both sorrow and hope. "That's the first step," she said softly. "Forgiving yourself is the hardest part, but it's the most important." And in that moment, the journey toward redemption began. For both of them. It would not be easy. There would be setbacks, pain, and frustration. But there was also something more. A chance for healing, for forgiveness, and for growth. They had both made mistakes. They had both carried the weight of their choices. But now, they stood together, no longer bound by the past, but determined to move forward, one step at a time, toward a future that was still uncertain, but filled with the possibility of redemption. As the nurse looked at the man before her, she knew that the road ahead would not be easy. But she also knew that it was a road worth traveling. And for the first time in years, she felt the weight of regret lift, replaced by the quiet certainty that redemption was possible, if they were both willing to fight for it. The nurse's heart pounded as she stared at the man before her, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The room, once filled with tension and unspoken words, now felt eerily quiet. The man, this stranger who was still, in some ways, the broken child she had once known, stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor. There was a strange stillness about him, as if he was waiting for something, some sign, some twist of fate to give him the strength to move forward. But the truth was, he was at a crossroads. The choices he made now could either lead him to redemption or keep him trapped in the darkness of his past. For a brief, terrifying moment, she wondered if he would shut down again, if he would retreat into the walls he had built around himself, never allowing anyone to reach him. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him a second time. He had been her patient years ago, and she had promised herself that she would never give up on him. But here now, there was a sense of finality hanging in the air, like the last breath before a storm. She couldn't let him slip through her fingers again, not this time. The nurse took a slow, deliberate step forward, her hands trembling as she reached out to him. There was so much at stake in this moment. She knew it wasn't just about his past. It was about his future. It was about breaking free from the chains of anger and regret that had kept him imprisoned for so long. "You don't have to face this alone," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, as though the very words held the weight of everything they had both experienced. "You've spent so much time in the dark, in the pain of your past, but you have a choice now. You don't have to keep running from it. You don't have to keep hiding from it." Her words hung in the air between them, thick with the tension of everything they both had left unsaid. The man's face was unreadable, but his eyes, their depth, the darkness that lingered within them, spoke volumes. He had been through so much, and yet here he was, still standing. It was more than just survival. There was strength in him that had yet to be fully realized, a flicker of hope in the face of all the destruction he had endured. For a moment she thought he might walk away again, might reject her offer of help and retreat back into his isolation. But then something shifted. The tension in his posture relaxed ever so slightly. His head lifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he met her gaze. His eyes were filled with uncertainty, but there was something else there, something she hadn't seen before, a glimmer of hope. "I don't know how to fix myself," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know where to start." The nurse felt her heart ache for him. She knew that feeling, the overwhelming sense of being lost, of not knowing how to start over after everything had gone wrong. But she also knew that the hardest part was taking that first step. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said, her voice steady but filled with empathy. "You don't have to have it all figured out. No one does. But the important thing is that you're here. You're still fighting." There was a long silence. The room seemed to hold its breath as the man processed her words, the weight of everything he had been through slowly settling over him. But then, just as she thought he might retreat again, he did something she hadn't expected. He looked up at her, and for the first time, there was a flicker of resolve in his eyes. "You're right," he said, his voice stronger now, his shoulders squared with a quiet determination. "I've spent so many years thinking that I couldn't change, that I couldn't overcome everything I've been through. But I see now that I have to try. I can't keep running from it. I have to face it." The nurse's heart swelled with a mix of pride and relief. She had known deep down that he had it in him. She had known that the strength he needed was always there, buried beneath the layers of hurt and anger. But now, in this moment, she saw it, his first real step toward redemption. It was small, tentative, but it was a step nonetheless. "You don't have to do it alone," she said, her voice steady, filled with quiet encouragement. "We'll face it together. I'll be here. I won't leave you." And just like that, the weight of the moment shifted. The room, once heavy with the past, began to feel lighter, as if a new chapter was beginning. The man wasn't healed, not yet, but for the first time in years, there was hope. He had chosen to confront his demons, to fight for something more than just survival. He had chosen to take a step toward healing, even if it was the smallest one. The nurse felt her own resolve strengthen in that moment. She had promised herself that she would never give up on him, no matter how difficult the journey. And now, seeing him take the first step, she knew that this was just the beginning. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be setbacks, obstacles, moments of doubt, but they had a chance now. A real chance to overcome the darkness that had defined his life for so long. The man took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as if he were preparing for the next step. And then, with a sense of quiet strength, he nodded. "I'll try. I don't know if I'll ever be the person I was meant to be, but I'll try to be better." And in that moment, something changed. The nurse could see it in his eyes, the flicker of determination that had been buried beneath the layers of anger and regret. It wasn't just a promise to her. It was a promise to himself. And that, more than anything, was the beginning of something extraordinary. The nurse smiled, a soft, encouraging smile. She could see the potential in him now, the strength that had always been there, hidden beneath the scars. "That's all. Anyone can ask," she said, her voice warm with compassion. "Just try." And as they stood there in the stillness of the room, it was clear that the path ahead would not be easy. But it was a path worth walking. Together. The nurse stood silently, watching as the man before her took a deep breath, his hands shaking ever so slightly as if the weight of everything he had carried for so long was finally starting to settle. The air in the room had shifted, no longer filled with the oppressive darkness of the past, but with the faint light of a new beginning. It was as if, in this single moment, the years of pain, fear, and regret had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, unspoken truth. Redemption, healing, and hope were not only possible, they were now within reach. The man's eyes softened as he turned his gaze to the nurse, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. For the first time in so many years, the walls he had built around himself seemed to crumble, piece by piece. He wasn't the angry, broken boy who had begged for help in the darkness. He wasn't even the hardened man who had carried his bitterness into adulthood. He was something new, something whole. The transformation wasn't instant. He wasn't miraculously healed in this moment, and the road ahead would still be filled with challenges. But he had made a choice. He had chosen to face the truth of his past, and more importantly, to choose a future defined not by his scars, but by his ability to overcome them. The nurse could see the shift in him. It was subtle, but profound. He wasn't just waiting for someone to come and save him anymore. He wasn't looking for someone to fix him. No, he was finally ready to take ownership of his own story. He was ready to begin the hard work of healing himself, and perhaps most importantly, he was ready to allow himself the grace to be imperfect along the way. "You don't have to do it all at once," the nurse said gently, her voice filled with compassion. "There's no rush. Take it one day at a time. You've already taken the first step, and that's the hardest part. The rest will come, and you'll never be alone in this." For the first time, the man smiled, a small, fragile smile that spoke volumes. It wasn't a smile of complete happiness, not yet, but it was one of acceptance. Acceptance of the fact that he had suffered, but that suffering didn't define him. Acceptance of the fact that it was okay to have scars, but that those scars could also be a source of strength. Acceptance of the fact that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about learning to live with it, to make peace with it, and to move forward despite it. "I think I've been too afraid to hope," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I've spent so long thinking that I wasn't worth saving." that I wasn't good enough to change. But I see now. I see that I have a choice. I can choose to keep running from the past, or I can choose to move towards something better. And I want to choose better. The nurse felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it wasn't one of sadness. It was a tear of relief, of joy. She had feared for so long that he would remain trapped in his pain, unable to escape the cycle of self-loathing and anger. But now, in this moment, she saw the spark of something brighter. The man before her was no longer defined by his wounds. He was beginning to see himself as someone worthy of love, of change, of growth. "You are worthy," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've always been worthy." He looked at her, the vulnerability in his eyes still raw, but no longer overshadowed by bitterness. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not giving up on me." The nurse reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of support and reassurance. "I never will. No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." For a moment, the two of them stood there, the weight of the past finally beginning to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity and hope. The road ahead would still be difficult, and they both knew it. There would be moments when the shadows of the past would try to creep back in, when the man would doubt himself, when the nurse would question whether she was doing enough. But in this moment, there was something unshakable between them, a quiet confidence that no matter how hard the journey, they would face it together. The man took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in years. The nurse felt a sense of peace wash over her, knowing that the decision to walk alongside him had been the right one. There were no guarantees, no promises that everything would turn out perfectly, but there was a shared understanding between them now. They were not bound by the mistakes of the past. They were not prisoners to their histories. They were free to move forward, to build something new, something beautiful, from the remnants of what had once been broken. As the man walked toward the door, ready to face the world beyond, he paused and turned back to the nurse. "I think I'm ready," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "I think I'm finally ready to try." The nurse smiled, her heart swelling with pride and hope for the future. "And that's all you need. Just keep moving forward. Keep trying. You don't have to be perfect, but you have to keep going." And with that, the man stepped into the world beyond the door, a world that no longer seemed quite so dark or overwhelming. It was a world full of possibilities, full of second chances, and full of hope. He wasn't fixed, not yet, but he had made the choice to live with purpose, to embrace the uncertainty, and to believe at last that he was worthy of healing. The nurse watched him go, a quiet smile on her lips. The future was uncertain, yes, but there was something else in the air, a sense of clarity, of peace, and of hope. The journey was far from over, but the beginning of healing had finally arrived.